Have you ever studied genealogy? Are you interested in your roots, where you've come from? We return to our study in Acts, and we follow Paul and Barnabas to Pisidian Antioch, and here they are going to share the good news with the Jews. They do so in the synagogue, and Paul chooses to begin by reminding them of their very important story. The story begins with a man named Abram, who lived in Ur in the land of the Chaldeans. The Lord was so impressed with his faithfulness that he made Abram three promises. I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless all people through you, and I will give you a promised land. It all hinged upon a great nation. And the problem with that is Abram and his wife Sarah had no children. Yet, to solidify the promise in Abram's mind, God changed his name to Abraham, which means father of many. And even though Sarah was barren, they were very old. Abraham was 100 and Sarah 90. God gave them a son. They named him Laughter, Isaac in Hebrew. Isaac set off and ended up marrying a woman named Rebekah. And they would have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was actually born first of those twin boys, but Jacob came out grasping his heel. That's why he was called Jacob, which means heel grabber. In time, though, that name came to mean deceiver, because Jacob was deceptive. He deceived his brother Esau out of his birthright and would also deceive his own father soon after. Jacob, though, married two women, sisters, Rachel and Leah, and through them would have 12 sons. And in time, Jacob would mature. His name would be changed from heel grabber to Israel, which means striver with God. Jacob's son Joseph was especially significant to him. He loved him dearly, and the brothers were jealous, so they sold him into slavery. Joseph eventually found his way into Egypt, and after an up and down roller coaster ride, he would end up second command of the most powerful nation in the world. It was here in the land of Egypt that through Joseph, Abraham and his sons would come to live there in the land of Goshen, and they would multiply greatly. But a Pharaoh would come to power that didn't remember what Joseph had done for that nation. He came to despise the Hebrew people, feared them because of their numbers, and he turned them into slaves. In fact, the very word Hebrew is probably an Egyptian slur, which means dust. That's how they saw the people. And they lived in misery for 400 years. They cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent them a deliverer in the form of a baby. He was born to a Hebrew couple, and to keep him safe from Pharaoh's edict to kill all male babies, they put him in a basket and sent him afloat in the Nile. But lo and behold, there, Pharaoh's own daughter found him. She drew him out of the water and called him Moses, which means drawn out. Moses would grow up, end up leaving for a while and returning to deliver God's people out of Egyptian bondage. The Egyptians worshipped several gods, including Re, most powerful, god of the sun, Hapi, god of the Nile. And through plagues sent through Moses, God brought one by one each of those gods down. The sun turned dark, the Nile turned to blood. Pharaoh gave them permission to leave, but then changed his mind, followed them into the Red Sea, where the waters closed and destroyed them. God had then issued again his covenant to them on Mount Sinai to be a great nation, to receive a promised land, and to bless all people through them. The Lord offered this covenant not because they were a powerful nation. It was because of God's own mercy and the love, because they were least of all people. He led them to the land of Canaan, and they sent out 12 spies to search out the promised land. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, came back and gave a favorable report of the land and said, "We can take this nation." But 10 spies said they could not. The people listened to the 10 spies, and the Lord was very angry. He made them to wander 40 years, a year for each day they had been spying out the land, until that generation had passed. Then, at the appointed time, the Lord brought them back to the edge of the promised land and led them across through Joshua. They went in, but they didn't exactly follow the Lord's instructions. They didn't take out all the enemies of God there, and they would be a thorn in their flesh. Even among the tribes themselves, they would fight against each other. And they would enter into a cycle in Judges of where they would be oppressed by an enemy, cry out to the Lord would send them a deliverer, and that deliverer would deliver them, such as Ehud, Deborah, Samson, Gideon. But the cycle would always continue. Finally, the people called for a king to be like the other nations. God would submit and give them a king. Saul would be the first, a valiant soldier, but he became addicted to the power and prestige of his position. Kingship would fall to David. David was a man of great faith, evidenced in his defeat of the mighty Goliath. David, though, would come also to struggle with his pride and arrogance. But David was different in that he could humble himself and confess his sin. And the Lord promised to David that one day one of his descendants would sit upon the throne and would rule forever. David's son, Solomon, would take over reign upon David's death. But Solomon had been only in the grave a short while when the kingdom would split. 10 tribes would go to the north, and they would establish the northern kingdom called Israel. That kingdom would be destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The southern kingdom would be conquered itself by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The people there were exiled, and they cried out to God. And the God sent them a deliverer, not in a person, but a nation. Persia would conquer the Babylonians and allow the Hebrew people to return to their promised land and rebuild the walls and the temple through leaders like Nehemiah and Ezra. For several hundred years, the people remembered God's promises, but there was silence from the prophets. They read the prophecies of God's promise to make them into a great nation, to give them a promised land, and to bless all nations through them. 400 years would pass of silence. And we come to the New Testament, that silence is broken by the voice of John the Baptist crying out in the spirit of Elijah. He speaks to a people that seems far from the fulfillment of those promises. They are weak, and they are dominated now by a new oppressor, Rome. But John the Baptist proclaimed a Messiah was coming, and even pointed him out, Jesus. Jesus, whom the Jewish leaders rejected because they wanted an earthly king who would lead them to victory over the Romans and sit on an earthly throne. The Jewish leaders had him assassinated by the hands of the Romans, but God raised him from the dead. Herod, though, died. Pilate as well. David, former great kings and mighty men have all perished and turned to dust, but Jesus lives. And he proclaims a message still today, not of rules, but of relationship with a mighty God. We are a mighty nation because we belong to God's kingdom, and our King still sits on the throne forever, Jesus Christ. We have a promised land of heaven, of which we're already citizens, and nothing can take that away from us. And we have been called by God to bless all people in His name. Let us carry out His commission to be a light to the world. May grace and peace be multiplied to you in the name of God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ.